Hi, everyone, and welcome. Thanks for joining us for today's Meet the Analyst webinar, CMO-Level Insights to Elevate Your Personalization Strategy. I'm your host, Jeremy Goldman, Director of the Marketing and Commerce Briefings at Insider Intelligence in New York City, and I'm joined by my colleague, Principal Analyst Dave Frankland, also in New York. Hey, Dave, great to have you here.
Hey, Jeremy, great to be here.
Yeah, before we get into today's main presentation, I'd really like to thank BlueConic for making today's webinar possible and welcome Sam Ngo, Director of Product Marketing at BlueConic. She's joining us from New Jersey. Hey, Sam.
Hi, Jeremy. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, a few things before we dive in, everybody. We have a ton of information to share, but there's no need to take notes. We're going to email you a link to view the slides and the full recording afterwards, but we do want you to participate. Just use the chat window on the right to submit questions at any time during the presentation, and we're going to get to as many as we can during the Q&A. So with that, Dave, yeah, I'm really looking forward to this deck because I feel like people are really focused on personalization, given all the uncertainty around and how personalization has the potential to drive revenue and outcomes. So what's on the agenda for us today?
Yeah, so we're going to dive into personalization, and it's a phrase or a term that has been around obviously for quite a long time, but not everyone uses the term to mean the same thing. And not everyone includes the same things when they talk about personalization. And I'd also say not everyone agrees on how effective a brand is at executing on the promise of personalization. And just as one quick example before we jump into the agenda, wanted to share some results from a sail-through study from March this year, which in this case was focused on retailers. But in that study, they found that 71% of respondents said that they feel they excel at personalized marketing. Now, it's hard to believe that 71% of any group excels at such a complex initiative. And, unfortunately, not all of their customers agree. In that same study, only 34% of customers said that they believe that brands excel at personalization. And so, as I mentioned, it can mean different things to different people, from tailoring content on a website based on the visitor's browsing behavior, all the way to sort of customizing products to a specific individual. So what I thought would be helpful is, before we dive into the main content, is let's level set on what we at Insider Intelligence mean by personalization. And it's worth noting, having just used that example of customized product, that we don't include customization in our definition of personalization. So specifically, we describe personalization as delivering a tailored experience or communication to an individual using information a company knows about them and their needs. And you can break that down into multiple parts, right? So it's the tailored experience or communication. Often companies use it just for communication, but it can also obviously be an experience. Using information, we're going to get into a lot of data conversation today, and I'm sure Sam will add to that when we get into our Q&A later on. This is a heavily data-dependent initiative within an organization. And it's also need-based, right? So in best examples, it's based on what the customer needs, not necessarily what the company is just trying to move off their shelves at that moment. So, the personalization spectrum can range from the most basic "Hi, Jeremy" email greeting to an interaction with a customer that incorporates all of the information that a company knows about the customer. So let me bring that to life a little bit. If we use an example of a hotel company, maybe they receive a phone call from a guest who's scheduled to stay at its property that night. And based on the phone number, the hotel can immediately recognize who's calling, recognize them as a loyalty program member, know that their flight was canceled, or infer that they might be calling to rearrange their stay. They may be able to immediately look at their preferences if they are going to be staying that night, as it relates to the type of room they prefer, proximity to the elevator, whether they want feather free, whatever that might be. And if they're a frequent diner at the hotel chain, they might offer to set up a reservation if they're going to be arriving late, for example. But that example of setting up offering to make a reservation is a great example of being need-based, right? Because if it's also a guest who, or if it's on the other hand, a guest who never dines, offering to set up a reservation could actually feel like an unwanted upsell and not necessarily solving the customer's needs. So that notion of understanding the customer need is really important. And getting personalization right is all about that idea of delivering on need. And as we'll see, it should benefit both the customer and the company. So with that as background, here's what I'm going to spend the next sort of 15, 20 minutes or so delving into. And we'll look at why personalization matters, looking at both the consumer, customer, and the business side. We'll look at some of the challenges to getting personalization right. And then how companies can enhance and elevate their approach, again, to benefit both sides of that equation. So as I say, let's start with this question of why personalization matters. And what I wanted to do, first of all, was sort of say, as simply as I can at the very beginning, customers want brands to personalize their communications. According to this May 22, 2022 Salesforce report, 73% of respondents expect companies to understand their unique needs and expectations. Really explicit, almost 3/4 of customers, and 62% think companies should anticipate their needs. And that notion of anticipatory marketing or commerce is particularly challenging. It's hard enough to identify a need, and it's glaringly obvious when companies get it wrong. So it really does require a careful, planful, empathetic approach. And then one last number to call out real quick here is the 56% of respondents that expect companies to always personalize offers to them. So it's not just that communication or experience, it's also the offer you're making to me should be personalized to me. The other thing I'd point out is, as you can see here, all of these expectations are on the rise. We've increased all of those numbers since 2020. And we as customers are increasingly demanding of companies. We expect a lot from companies. And the other thing I'd say is that every positive interaction we have with one company raises the bar of expectation that we have with the next company we interact with. So I refer to that as the transference of entitlement or transference of expectation. And what that means for every company listening, though, is that you're not just competing with brands in your category. Customers know that companies like Amazon and Spotify and Netflix can identify, anticipate, and solve their needs. And they expect their banks, their travel companies, retailers, insurance companies, whatever industry you're in, they expect every brand that they engage with to do the same thing and to anticipate and deliver on that need. But it's not just about the customer. Personalization also delivers results from a business point of view. It drives engagement with customers. This is from an Acquia survey last October that found that over half of companies rolled out more personalization, reported greater customer engagement with their brand, and almost half saw better conversions. So maybe not a surprise, but this is obviously starting from a base of companies that already had personalization. This was rolling out increased personalization. And then in terms of the hard business benefit, it was a great study by McKinsey in November last year, where they looked at companies and segmented them by revenue growth. And they sort of segmented the companies they examined into three groups of sort of faster, middle, and slower growing companies across a whole wide group of elements. But one of those elements was personalization. And they found that companies that grew revenues more quickly generated 40% more revenues from personalization than slower growing companies. So it wasn't the only factor, but when you looked at those faster growing companies, they were far more likely to be driving revenues based on personalization than the slower growing companies. And McKinsey specifically pointed out that companies that had sort of nailed personalization saw more repeat customers from repeat purchasers from new customers. And they saw year-over-year spending increasing by all customers. And these faster growing companies are just using personalization to build and enhance customer relationships. It's not a matter of just sticking somebody's name in an email or on a mailing. McKinsey actually called out the phrase that these organizations organized their business around personalization. So it's not a one and done thing. It's something that the businesses have built and organized their business around. So we see all this this great benefit from personalization. Customers want it, businesses benefit. So why is there such disparity between how well companies execute on it? Why do we see that difference between the 71% of companies that think they excel and the 34% of their customers that agree? And in essence, I mean, I'd sort of say quite simply, this is hard to do. It requires a lot of disparate parts of the business working together. That requires focus. It requires consensus. It requires alignment. It requires investment. And as we all know, I'm assuming everyone on the phone or everyone on the webinar is currently or has worked for a company, and focus, consensus, alignment, investment are not easy things to come by. So let's jump into some of the detail around these challenges and what we think marketers need to focus on to get personalization right. What I'd say is that this is as I said here, it's sort of an interconnected set of solutions that are required to nail personalization. It's no one element. You can't just light up a new technology, sort of press play and expect everything to work. There is technology, obviously, as a major factor, but it's also processes, strategy. There's a people component. There's, as I mentioned, sort of that internal alignment. There's a lot to get right. And when you remember back to that definition of personalization that we shared, delivering that tailored experience or communication to an individual using information a company knows about them and their needs. And I did promise we would talk about data. And the core or foundation of personalization is really comes down to data. The information that a company knows about a customer and their needs. And it's not just one type of data, right? Companies capture a massive array of customer data. Think about the attributes we know about customers, whether that's as basic as sort of their age or gender, name, address, etc., to what car they drive and whether they have a yard, which can be really important pieces of information to know if you're trying to send something that's personalized to a customer. There's a famous example of a lot of New Yorkers receiving lawn focused communication from one of the big DIY retailers, and there's not that many New Yorkers that have lawns. So just as basic as that can be very, very helpful. But as you expand out, there's behavioral data, which can be anonymous, like a browsing behavior, but much more we're looking at what do we know about customers? How often do they shop with us or interact with us? How often do they return things? What types of things do they buy? All of those things. Do they recommend us? All of those things we think of as behavioral data. There's attitudinal and preference data. So that sort of includes the types of communication that a customer likes to receive, their general likes and dislikes, and even their attitudes on social and political issues, which are becoming more and more important in what customers want to see from companies. And then there's sort of the context, what's going on at the moment. That can be everything from if you can define why a customer is contacting you, what's their need in the moment, whether that's information or entertainment or product or service, as well as things like their location. All of those things can affect what we know about the customer, and all of that has to be captured and managed. And usually each of those data types that I just went through, and there are many, many more, they're coming from a slew of different sources in a bunch of different formats at different times of the day, week, month, year. And all of that data has to be captured, integrated, sort of normalized and integrated with each other, associated with a common profile so that what we know about Dave is associated with Dave in other formats and different information types. And then made available to other solutions, either to sort of for analytics purposes to glean insights from it, or for communication purposes to act on that information in some shape or form. Now, obviously, when talking about customer data, and as soon as we go into the detail that I did, there's always a flag that goes up related to either privacy or security or both. And both privacy and security have become board level concerns for businesses. It is absolutely critical that firms stay within the letter and the spirit of privacy regulation, and invest to keep customer data secure. But it's also worth mentioning that customers understand that in order to get personalized offers, messages, whatever else, that companies need to use their data. But what's interesting is that they have different and varying levels of comfort with companies using that data. Generally, if there's a benefit to them, that they see that there's a general comfort level, but it's not a straight one-for-one comfort. And so, if we look at different data from a couple of sources here, this is from February of this year. Merkle put out a study that showed consumers, do understand that companies use personal data to craft and deliver those tailored messages. And in that study, nearly 9 in 10 respondents said they're likely to enjoy receiving personalized offers based on their interests in browsing or purchase history. And a similar number were willing to provide more information after a positive experience with a brand. And then they were especially willing to provide personal information if they would receive custom offers and products tailored to their interests. So sort of there's that very explicit quid pro quo, if I could say it, when there is a perceived direct value that consumers have shown that they are willing to share that. But it's not a straight swap. So research from Airship conducted by Sapio, research here on the right, just shows that the differences in comfort levels that vary based on data types. So customers far more willing to share their email address and name than even their physical address or phone number, for example, and also by generation.
Dave, sorry
yeah, go ahead.
to interrupt. I was just going to say, this is really interesting to me because this is obviously something we cover in our briefing quite often. And one thing that's really interesting to me from an attitude standpoint is everybody likes to say, well, the younger consumers, they are very privacy conscious and they are not willing to give up anything. And actually what you see in some cases from this data is that they are willing to give something up as long as they're getting something in return. So I'm wondering if there's anything else that really strikes you about this data that just stands out.
Yeah, I agree. And I think the younger generations, according to this data, are more comfortable sharing, right, than their older cohorts. I think what you can see there's a similar trend line in terms of they're not as comfortable across the board. The surprising one here for me was social. I think this may be a case of what people say versus what they do. I have two older teenagers, and they're not that focused or worried about their data when they're on Snapchat or TikTok or, well, that's their two things of choice. Instagram, I guess. They're leaving breadcrumbs of everywhere they go. Everyone knows who they follow, what they do, etc. And so there probably is a little bit of survey bias in here. But in general, I think it's fair to say that younger consumers are more comfortable sharing. The question that we won't know for some time is whether this is an age or a generational change. We all do stupid things when we're younger. And will these folks kind of become more privacy conscious, or will they sort of turn off some of that spigot as they age, as they maybe have their own kids, etc.? That remains to be seen. We'll have to come back to the same place in about 15, 20 years time and discuss what we learned. But what I would say, Jeremy, to sum this sort of slide up a little bit, is it's kind of really clear to me looking at this is, the more a company knows, the more it can personalize an interaction. But just because marketers can use certain information, just because they know this information, doesn't mean that they should. There needs to be some probing and from some very careful steps here to make sure that value is being delivered, so that you sort of gain that permission, but not using it too much so that it becomes that sort of creepy or intrusive that we sometimes hear about when we have the privacy conversation. And so really important to gauge customer comfort levels and sort of exercise restraint regarding which information to use. And sometimes that's going to be different, what you use with different individuals or groups. So that's data management. I won't spend as long on each one of these elements, but and as I said, I think we'll hear more from Sam later on that. But let's talk about once companies have data in place, what else is needed. And next up is data on its own is not that helpful, right? Even once it's integrated into a single profile, it's very hard for companies to act on that in sort of raw form. And so for years, companies have been investing in analytics and layering that on in order to sort of understand past customer behavior, looking at patterns both across groups as well as individuals, using it to predict future behavior, prescribe potential actions, what to do next based on that available data. And so, very often there's either an analytics team within the marketing organization, or they may rely on a central data science and analytics team. And those folks are using a huge range of sort of segmentation, modeling, visualization solutions that marketers can key off of those insights. But there's very seldom just one potential course of action that a company takes based on all that information and based on the insights. And so the next step then is to sort of determine the next best action. We refer to that as decisioning. And so whatever that action might be, it might be do nothing, it might be communicating, it might be all sorts of, what to offer, which creative to show, but based on all of the insights we have and the objectives of the business, balancing all of that to determine that next best action. And there's a variety of software solutions out there. Most companies use automation software to aid in that decisioning process. It's hard to do just based on the volume most companies are dealing with, and to do it at scale and do it at speed of customers. So typically the most sophisticated teams will rely on enterprise-wide decisioning engines. Once that decision is made, there's an orchestration need. So something has to carry that decision to the point of interaction. And so again, this is often an automation, some sort of marketing automation solution, campaign management solution that sort of coordinates that across the marketing and advertising tech stack. And orchestration systems essentially, carry that decision to email, advertising, web platform, wherever it might be. Could be a person. And then the sort of final step, the step that the customer experiences is at the action layer. So those execution platforms, or a screen that surfaces up what to do next to an employee, for example, delivering that personalized interaction as close as possible or directly to the customer, and ensuring that sort of offer, message, creative content is all both relevant and beneficial to them in the moment based on their need. Now, if you listen to all of that and you think, that's nothing like what goes on in our organization, you're not alone. I'm sort of describing some of I'm making it sound really clean and simplistic, albeit very complex. But we see everything from companies that personalize in one or two channels on a website or in email, to those highly sophisticated approaches in which there's a centralized decisioning engine that's actually augmented by in-moment decisions at the point of interaction, because something has to be done in that nanosecond. And that's just a really advanced approach that needs clearly defined customer and company objectives. It needs a strong foundation of rules, guardrails, and usually has a very heavy dose of machine learning and artificial intelligence to manage that at scale and at speed. But if all of this doesn't sound difficult enough, there's also other factors that make it even more challenging. And so I'll just go through a few of these relatively quickly. But as I mentioned, most companies start with personalization in a couple of channels, and as they evolve, they have to try to sort of combine that decisioning across additional channels. And so it's no longer about what's the right message to show in the moment, it's what's the right message to show where, for example. And with each element that gets added, it becomes more and more complex. Typically what we'll find is folks might sort of then take to doing all outbound communication next, or something like that. But as I say, for each layer, it just gets more complex, exponentially more difficult. We're both trying to communicate across more sources, but we're also capturing data from more places. And it's when companies go omni-channel, or however you describe it in your organization, that's when we get into that sort of enterprise-wide decision approach. And that's usually when we start to see heavy reliance on automation and machine learning. Every piece of information is essentially an opportunity to improve the interaction and personalization for next time around. And so the person's location I mentioned earlier, via someone's IP address or some other indicator, if we know where somebody is, we can also know their time zone, and that might affect what we do, how we do it. And that might also affect what we do the next time we're interacting with them, because we had that information previously. But that external context can also be, if I know where somebody is, I can know what the weather is, or the traffic is, or that flights are being delayed, or it's all going to depend on my business industry or business model. But all of those things, how close is somebody to a store or branch, or all of those elements, that just knowing someone's location, again, it provides significantly more opportunity to get something right, but it also adds significant complexity. As I mentioned, obviously it's possible to personalize interactions based on anonymous browsing, but personalization is really when we think the person is in the word, right? It's most effective when companies leverage known information to tailor the engagement. And so that requires identifying the consumer. And as folks on the phone are no doubt fully aware, that's a feat that's increasingly difficult thanks to the walled garden tech platforms, the regulators that are focused on privacy, consumers blocking ads or opting out, and cookie deprecation, making it more difficult to capture online data. It's just increasingly difficult to identify who someone is in the moment, and companies have to earn that permission to do so.
Yeah, Dave, actually, just to jump in here, this is for the executives that I'm interviewing, that they're saying that this is the #1 change in the way that they're going about their jobs when it comes to personalization, is just the whole entire, essentially, identity resolution went from something that people did not spend a lot of time on to something that people orient their whole entire programs around. And wondering if you're finding the same, as just this being something that's just become bigger and bigger over the last few years.
Absolutely. It is one of, if not the biggest challenge for most digital marketers. For pro subscribers, Paul Verna has written a fantastic report recently on identity that they can download and access. Definitely recommend checking it out. And yes, it is increasingly difficult. And I think, again, to trailer a little bit of what I know Sam is going to mention, I know she's going to dig into it a little bit too. Just moving ahead here in the interest of time, I mentioned the increase in channels earlier, but there's also some of those channels are becoming addressable too. So addressable TV and in location display advertising, they present, again, that sort of either new, or for some companies expanding opportunities to deliver personalized content. But again, they add that complexity, represent more places to capture data, as well as the need to coordinate messaging across even more addressable channels. And then the last quick thing I'll mention here is this sort of back-end data. And this is one of those things I don't think we not necessarily might have mentioned even a couple of years ago. During the pandemic, obviously, supply chain has become a weird back-end company term that we as consumers start to use when we're talking about the companies we interact with. And it's hard enough for businesses to determine that sort of best action. You've got to go through that whole sort of capture data, analyze it, make a decision, orchestrate, act. But then you also need to make sure that you're syncing up with your back-end data. There's nothing worse that you could do than come up with what's the right offer that Jeremy might be interested in, get that right, put it in front of him. It's the perfect product to promote at the perfect time. It's meets his need in the moment, everything else, but we don't have it in stock. All I've done is raise the expectation and then fail to deliver on the promise. And the most likely scenario in that case is that I'm actually going to raise that desire and send you off to a competitor. So that back-end data is just as important as the data about customers, and probably even more important than the contextual external data that I mentioned a couple of minutes ago. So to round out then sort of how to evolve an approach, one of our calls in the report that we wrote recently was the need for CMOs to get involved, and whether it's specifically the CMO or the senior most market or the senior most other part of the business. I'm not saying it has to literally be CMO on someone's business card, but it really does require executive commitment to get right at this advanced level. We outlined the difference between those fast-growing revenue companies in the McKinsey study, those companies that organize their business around personalization, and that can't happen at a department or channel level. It requires that sort of stewardship and championship and ownership at the highest level of organizations. And so our research shows that CMOs who do engage with their organization's personalization approach can use that opportunity to align the company around the customer, establish stronger customer connections, tie their department to the business strategy more effectively, which, as we wrote about earlier this year in our CMO research, are some of the core things that CMOs are trying to achieve. So I'm gonna round out with sort of 4 key opportunities and recommendations for organizations, really tailored on that sort of marketing leader. Again, whether it's the CMO title, I'm less concerned with, and more the fact that it's somebody who has that authority inside the organization to drive this through at an enterprise-wide level. And the first thing I would say is, by having this at a senior level, you can sharpen the focus for the organization. You have the permission to sort of determine and drive the conversation around whether, why, and how to invest. And I've alluded to it or said it explicitly about personalization efforts that are disjointed, sort of whether that's in an individual channel or focused exclusively on tactical and even vanity metrics. But senior marketers really can bring focus to the efforts and take the lead, drive that conversation on what should be done and why, and whether it's worth investing. Are we committed as an organization to doing this, to organizing around it, et cetera? And that requires that senior level commitment. They're better positioned to tie it to business objectives and help tie it to measurement, and frankly, there's going to be roadblocks to success, right? And so the more senior level that's championing this, the more likely it is that those roadblocks can be overcome. Next, I'd say is, and this is obviously tightly linked, is sort of aligning the organization, driving for that enterprise-wide approach. And so these senior folks can bring that enterprise-wide approach, but also the customer-focused lens to coordinate the investment. And there will be sort of uncomfortable conversations. Which product or service will get prioritized? If we're thinking about what's best for the customer, we're going to have to make prioritization decisions. How does that get decided? How do internal teams, how are they then compensated or evaluated if that starts to change? By definition, that requires a senior exec to rise above the sort of politics of those types of decisions. And it also requires working way outside the marketing department with IT, data, digital, customer experience, customer service. They might have duplicate investments, very different processes, and even competing goals. And so all of that has to be brought together. And ultimately, it's going to require coordination with finance to ensure that those customer-centric decisions also benefit the organization and are measured in the right way. And that's the key way to drive engagement. We've written, like I said, in the CMO report earlier this year, and Patty Saltis is writing in her CX research about the role of marketing and CX as the customer advocate. And ultimately, personalization should benefit the consumer. I've mentioned several times it's in our definition about understanding customer needs. And if the business is anticipating those needs and solving them, as long as they're doing that profitably and working with finance, tracking the right metrics, it will obviously also benefit the organization. And so acting as the customer advocate allows CMOs to balance competing factors. The customer's desire for privacy with their desire for relevance, and the organization's desire to anticipate needs without being invasive. And of course, the organization's desire to make money in order to remain in business. And then, looking to the future, again, by having someone senior involved, this is, as we've said, it's incredibly complex. There just isn't an easy button to solve this idea of personalization. And so executing at scale, as I sort of ran through that list of things that need to be done, requires a significant investment in data, analytics, decisioning, execution solutions, requires a rethink of processes and metrics. And it will, as companies evolve, it necessarily brings a greater emphasis on automation and machine learning. And so companies that are investing in, companies are already investing in a lot of solutions. So by having somebody really senior at that table, driving that conversation, it requires them to be conversant in everything from sort of core technology to AI, but it allows the organization to ensure that investments being made can benefit the consumer and keep those aligned along the way. So I hope that provides some useful insight to help those of you listening to think through factors to consider, and provide some sort of a blueprint to help you elevate your approach to personalization, what you need to think through as you grow. But speaking of the future, let me pass back to Jeremy, and I look forward to rejoining for the conversation with Sam and you, Jeremy.
That was great. Thanks, Dave. And before we get to your questions live and our special guest from BlueConic, quick apology if anybody might have experienced slight technical difficulties during the webinar today. Our production team is working on it, but don't worry about missing anything. You're going to receive the full playback by email following today's broadcast. Now, let's bring on Sam Ngo, Director of Product Marketing at BlueConic. Sam, I love that we have you here, considering how Dave spoke about personalization from a human perspective and what you've got to do internally to, pull it off successfully. But I feel like having the right technology on the back end is key to bringing personalization strategies to life, no?
Yeah, absolutely. You couldn't see me on screen, but I was nodding vigorously throughout Dave's presentation. So it's definitely all about people, process, technology, and technology plays a big role in being able to help companies navigate the complexity when it comes to managing their data, when it comes to managing consent as part of that, and making sure that that's being applied across all of your systems and sources. And most importantly, I think getting that unified data into the hands of these growth-focused users, right? Dave, you talked a lot about marketers and senior leadership that's really responsible for driving the customer experience. And I think in particular, having the right technology that's helping customers get the best experience requires having this back end of identity resolution, as mentioned, and all of the mechanisms that are required for that. So, I think many people on this call would probably relate to the fact that customer data today is fairly siloed in their organizations, whether that means it's channel specific, maybe it's team specific, like your web team is handling something completely differently than your customer service team, for example. And ultimately, that doesn't make for a great customer experience, right? If your customer is expecting a fully omni-channel experience, but your data is living in these silos, there's really no way to reconcile that without having customer identity really at the middle of that. And that's where, I think something like BlueConic comes into play, where it is about getting customer identity, creating these unified profiles, making sure that customers have this confidence in their data, that it's being consistently updated, the data is normalized, and then it's being used ultimately to orchestrate and drive customer experience. And what that really means is having, both those back-end things, as you mentioned, in terms of making sure you're connected to inventory, right? As well as connected to the behavioral attributes, customer scores and modeling, even, for example, if you wanted to incorporate customer lifetime value, and ultimately being able to use that to drive the activation side of things. And ideally, right, that happens in real time, that happens in an expected time frame, at least for a customer, because you have the mechanisms in place to do that. What that also means enterprise-wide is reducing the silos, right, between all of these teams that may be used to pulling manual lists to create segmentation, and really driving that operational efficiency when it comes to allowing a business team to actually create those segments. And it opens them up to be able to innovate much, much faster. If we have time, I'd love to share just 3 quick customer stories where, I think this illustrates well where a customer data platform can really help, bring personalization to the next level. And starting with Heineken in particular, Heineken, they're a customer of ours coming from the customer insights team in particular. And knowing that cookie deprecation was imminent, they wanted to move off of some of the legacy technologies they were used to rely on for a lot of their ad targeting. So, for example, DMPs. And what that meant for them in terms of shifting from third to first party data was really being able to get a view into their customer for the very first time. As an alcohol brand, as a CPG company, historically, they don't have a lot of transaction data. They actually can't have that transactional data. And so what they needed to do was start collecting first party data as people were visiting their website, as they were attending things like music festivals and stopping by their tent, for example, scanning badges, maybe attending virtual events, all the data that was coming from their sweepstakes and the partners that they work with for those types of things, and actually gather those into customer profiles. That was really their very first step in sort of a 0 to 1 in getting any type of customer data in the first place. And what that enabled them to do was actually get insight into their audiences for the very first time. Being able to tell, for example, who was a customer of Heineken versus Tecate or Dos Equis, which are their 3 brands that are working with BlueConic today. And finally, having that information, they were able to do things like launch, sounds simplistic, but an email campaign for the very first time, because they actually had mechanisms to organize and use their first party data. And then from there, their ambition and their goal is to then create personalized journeys for each of these customers, knowing what events they attended, knowing which sweepstakes they participated in, and again, just opening them up to these new opportunities here. The second story I'll tell is Taleo here. And so this is an interesting one. Their main goal was personalization at scale. And so what that meant for them is being able to tailor customer interactions at every point of the customer lifecycle, but operating across multiple regions, having very complex and multiple bundles of products. What they relied on BlueConic to do was really drive smarter customer engagement by being able to gather all of that data into customer profiles again, and then actually orchestrating through life cycles. And so this became an enterprise-wide initiative for them. And that change for the technology meant they needed to put data in the hands of their business users, not just their analytics teams who were used to building models and things like that, but actually closing the gap between things like running a next best action model and actually having that drive, an outcome, and being able to use that as part of their entire customer journey. And so part of Taleo's main goal here was to have BlueConic start to serve as the brain behind many of their marketing efforts, including their tools and tech that they currently use, like Salesforce Marketing Cloud, to actually do cross-sell and upsells in order to improve the customer journey over time. And again, what that meant for them, not only 3 times conversions in their cross-sell and upsell efforts, but actually it meant reducing those manual handoffs between those analytics teams and their business teams, just shortening that effort and making sure that they were actually delivering all of that in real time. And then lastly here, this education first, a global company, they operate in 50 plus markets, again, with a variety of products. And it comes back to the fact, again, that personalization is very complex, right? Everything around localization, for example, different user behaviors. There are even cultural aspects, for example, that they need to know. All of that data, it can be used to drive personalization. But you need to have the right mechanisms in place in order to capture that, in order to organize it, to make sure you're consenting to all of it as well. And that's where Education First relies on BlueConic, right? The ability for them to handle all of that variety of data across their various markets is actually what helps drive their sales team to deliver the right message at the right time. And so I think across all these three examples, very different use cases when it comes to personalization. As Dave mentioned at the top of this webinar, right? Personalization means different things to different people. And it's because those use cases and what you define as growth for your company through personalization is really going to vary. But at its core, what really matters is having that unified data from across all of your systems, because that's the thing that allows you to be customer-centric and really anticipate the needs of your customers in the end.
Wow, that was a lot in a short time period, but thanks, Sam. It's time to get to our audience Q&A, and we've received a lot of really great questions. I know we don't have a lot of time. I'd like to try to kind of commingle one or two first off. Building on what you just presented, Sam, and for both of you guys, does personalization work better for some industries and categories than others? And how should a brand be thinking about personalization differently if they're doing it on a B2B level? So kind of two-parter there, but anybody want to start off?
I can jump in. I think let's answer the first part first. So it definitely, look, it varies by company, never mind by industry, right? But I think there are definitely elements that group industries together. So Sam mentioned CPG. Pre the DTC emergence within CPG, most CPG companies didn't have a clue who their consumer was. The customer to them was the retailer they sold through. And so there was no direct relationship. There was very little data for them to capture. And many CPG companies are still in the infancy stage as it relates to anything other than personalizing often anonymous browsing on a website. You sort of take from there and you go to financial services, where there's a lot of know your customer data, but there's also regulation, right? So once I start to mingle in credit data, I've got very strict rules on what I can and can't do. All the way then to, I mentioned, I didn't realize until I heard myself saying it out loud that the examples I used earlier of Netflix and Spotify, they're entertainment companies, right? And so there's so much gaming, the same thing. By using the product, you're sharing data, and so it just enables me to personalize in moment and on an ongoing basis based on every interaction. So I think there's differences by company. Not everyone's as good as in entertainment's as good as Netflix and Spotify, right? But I think there definitely are opportunities for some industries that are different than others. But it ultimately, even Sam's three examples, right? It comes down to what are you trying to achieve, what data is available, and how do you knit together to meet that objective?
Yeah, one thing I'll add to that too, Dave, is we often talk to our customers who we actually find similarities among business models as well. Mm-hmm. So a retailer that has a subscription business, for example, is actually not that different from a publisher that also has a subscription business and is trying to get someone to renew before the end of their trial period or their subscription date. And so I think personalization can also be factored into this idea that whatever outcome you're trying to achieve in this case, depending on your business model, is actually the thing that's going to make a difference in terms of how you think about the type of data that you collect and why ultimately you're going to use that data to drive that outcome that you're looking for.
It's a really good point. I did, so earlier in today's presentation, Dave, you were talking a little bit about personalization being led at the senior level. But who are typically some of the key stakeholders that are weighing in on a company's personalization strategy, specifically these days?
Yeah, so marketing first and foremost, right? But again, that can take different forms in different organizations, right? So I would say there may be a digital group, there may be a CX group, there may be an e-commerce group that are very sort of tangential or tightly aligned with marketing, customer service or care, whatever it might be called in an organization, IT, if there's a separate data analytics group, finance I mentioned, and then we talked about supply chain. And so you start to sort of, as you rattle these things off, it's sort of everyone. If you're going to go to that McKinsey level of organizing the business around personalization, I think it's concentric circles of who's closer to if you put the customer at the center, who's closest to that, it's marketing, and then it's all these other elements that sort of, in some cases, interact directly with the customer, but they all need to be coordinated and aligned. And in some cases, are not directly engaging with the customer, like a supply chain or finance. But without them on board, it starts to fall apart.
Sam, how about for you? Who are the kind of the key stakeholders when people decide to work with you guys?
Yeah, absolutely. We characterize them as what we call growth-focused teams. And what that means for us is, across the enterprise, it's typically driven by, as Dave said, marketing, but it could be a CX team, it could be a digital team, it could be an analytics team even. But really their remit is to, try to bring the customer experience to life. And in the process of doing so, making sure that their teams can work internally as quickly as possible. And so I think that's where we see a lot of enterprise-wide efforts really be successful, is in this understanding that reducing the time it takes to get a segmentation back or to build a model and actually have the customer engagement score, for example, be able to send or trigger an email campaign, or be able to send that to an in-store associate even to tailor that in-store experience. All of those types of realizations requires, I think, enterprise-wide, interactions. And as Dave mentioned, having that senior level sponsorship in that case is really imperative to the success of the implementation and to doing personalization really at the scale that an organization would want to.
And I think this is a really great one to end on, because obviously with budgets being scrutinized, with the people not sure where the economy is going, how does somebody in the C-suite prove the ROI of personalization if they're trying to get a budget approved to start to have some type of personalization campaign or implementation of their own?
Yeah, I can start with that one. It's definitely a good question, and it's certainly a tricky one, especially in today's world. I think, of course, you can do things like measure customer lifetime value, increasing customer satisfaction, for example, retention, all of those things. But even more so, going back to the point I was just making about enterprise-wide collaboration and the fact that, you are doing this cost saving ultimately when it comes to being able to reduce the number of manual handoffs you have. I guess don't forget to factor in the fact that if you are not relying on an agency to pull a segment for you, and it's not going to cost you thousands of dollars every 3 weeks when you want to do that segment pull, and you're able to do that in-house, that's a huge cost saving, not just from that cost in itself, but also an opportunity for you to be able to innovate much faster, right? Going from ideation to execution of a new campaign idea in 2 days rather than 2.5 weeks is going to enable test and learn much more quickly. And ultimately, those are the things that will drive up your customer lifetime value, customer satisfaction scores, et cetera. It's not just the focus on those types of metrics.
Yeah, and I'd say a couple of things, Jeremy. I think one is I'm a huge believer in laddering, right? So I don't think that companies should abandon campaign metrics or any of these things, but ultimately you want to ladder that up to financial metrics. So Sam mentioned lifetime value, Are we changing? Are we driving? Are we bringing in more profitable customers, et cetera? The other thing I think is, evaluating technologies or investments based on change. So do we see incremental improvement? Incrementality is the core thing to measure. And then, you can also steal from traditional direct marketing technologies and create carve-outs. Pick a group of customers and don't personalize to them and see if there's any change in response, satisfaction, all those elements that Sam just talked about. What we find typically is companies will do that for a while and then they don't want to do that anymore because they realize we're leaving money on the table. So again, I think if I was to say nothing else on that one, it's make sure that you are aligned with the CFO, that you're measuring the right things, that you're measuring the right things in the right way, and that you're then cascading what it is we're aiming to drive as a business down to what we're measuring at the campaign, channel, sort of tactical level. It's okay to measure those things, but make sure they're connected to the bigger picture.
I think that's a terrific point to end on. That was really terrific, though. And unfortunately, it is all the time we have for today. But thanks again to Dave for joining us, and a very special thanks to Sam and to the team at BlueConic. Our eMarketer production crew behind the scenes also deserves a huge thank you for making this webinar possible. As promised, we'll be emailing you soon a link to the slides and the full recording. And before we wrap up, let me take a quick moment to tell you what's happening across eMarketer's media channels. You can register for upcoming live analyst and tech talk webinars at emarketer.com/webinars. On the audio side, don't forget to tune in to Behind the Numbers, eMarketer's daily podcast, wherever you find your podcasts, through Stitcher, through Spotify, you name it. And finally, please check out our newsletters. Thanks so much for joining us and enjoy the rest of your day.